Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 21, Section 4, New Approaches to Civil Rights. So, during the 1960s and 70s, African Americans built on the civil rights achievements of the 50s to advance their social, political, and legal status. So, in number one, the problems facing most African Americans lay in their lack of access to good jobs and adequate schooling. So, as we kind of move into the 60s and 70s, this is something that becomes kind of a source for contention. So, when LBJ becomes president, one of the things that he incorporates into his war on poverty and his Great Society was something called affirmative action. This is kind of tied into the Equal Opportunities Commission, but the affirmative action calls for companies, institutions, and schools doing business with the federal government to recruit African Americans or other minorities. And there are times when African Americans and minority groups, that would include ethnic minorities or minorities because of gender or minorities because of physical ailments, opportunities that they had once been denied, and in some cases getting preferential treatment for certain programs. And hence, this might change the way certain people are hired. Certain students are recruited for academic programs or even admission into college. So there are critics of these kind of programs, and they saw this as a form of what we call reverse discrimination or reverse racial discrimination, in which qualified white workers were kept from jobs. And that kind of leads to a court case that happened in 1978 that brought up this whole affirmative action thing into question. And it is the court case of the University of California of Davis and their regents versus a student named Bakke. Bakke had been a former Marine. He had a master's degree in electrical engineering, and he wanted to apply to the University of California Davis's medical school. Okay, he had a 3.46 GPA, making him very well qualified. While there were minority students that had much lower GPAs that were actually considered. So needless to say, the court basically declared that schools had an interest in maintaining a diverse student population and could use race as part of the admissions process. His argument was actually kind of under that equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment. And as time would go on, other court cases would be heard dealing with affirmative action, maybe even clarifying what these programs meant. But the Bakke case certainly got a lot of attention, and it started kind of a process of people questioning the whole use of affirmative action. Your next main idea. Most impoverished minority groups in America, Native Americans began organizing for their civil rights. And in 1968, we had the Indian Civil Rights Act that was passed, and it guaranteed reservation residents protections of the Bill of Rights, but it also recognized their legitimacy of local reservation law. So in the case of like our tribes here in Nebraska, if you were talking about, let's say, the Winnebagos, they would have certain protections under our Bill of Rights, meaning that they would have freedom of speech and they would have the right to having attorneys represent them in court, and they would have a right to civil trials and all those kind of things that are protected in that Bill of Rights. But at the same time, the laws that were established by the Winnebago Nation would also have kind of an equal, I guess you could say, authority over those people. So there are times like, for example, in Thurston County, where the Winnebago and Omaha Nations have their reservation, where the county sometimes doesn't have jurisdiction over things like cleaning the roads or sending out a rescue unit because it might interfere with the tribal law that also kind of is being held equal at that same time. So that's kind of what this act brought about. There were other incidences, and in number 6, the American Indian Movement, or AIM, occupied an abandoned federal prison at Alcatraz. Alcatraz Island is not very far from San Francisco. It's kind of in the Bay Area there. And starting in, I think, 1969, members of AIM occupied that site with the hopes of maybe getting people to recognize the fact that the federal government hadn't always upheld its promises, and that land, obviously, once held by Native Americans, was unjustly taken away from them. They also held a protest at Wounded Knee, South Dakota, that you can kind of see pictured down below there in the right-hand corner. But at this incident, they occupied the site of that massacre, and not very far from that site is a school and St. Francis of Assisi Church. And during their time of holding this, there were concerns about federal agents coming onto the reservation to arrest individuals. Needless to say, this was one of those incidences that was a little bit more violent and destructive. But needless to say, AIM is still around. They have been lobbying different state governments. I know in the state of Nebraska, they have been fighting to remove alcohol from White Cloud, which is up there closer to Valentine. And they were able to get that done. Number 7. Native Americans in some areas were allowed to operate gaming establishments or casinos under their own laws. And even though states might have prevented them doing so, they were able to do that under Native American law. So when we look at tribes like the Winnebago and also the Omaha Nation, they have at times run casinos. Right now, the Ponca are trying to establish a casino in the Omaha metropolitan area. All that would be protected under their reservational law. Our next main idea. During the 1970s, people with disabilities fought for greater rights and access to education and jobs. Number 8, the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968 mandated that new buildings constructed with federal funds had to be accessible to disabled persons. In other words, they had to be handicapped accessible, meaning that there had to be wider doorways, restroom accessibility, maybe door mechanisms to open up the doors. All those things had to be in place. Number 9, in educational practices, one trend was to mainstream or to bring into the regular classroom students with disabilities. Most schools have programs for remediation and special education, but the goal here of mainstreaming is to have a student who might have a disability be with their regular peers as much as possible and not isolated from their peers. And number 10, in 1990, Congress reenacted the far-reaching legislation known as the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, which banned discrimination against persons with disabilities in several areas, meaning that if there is a qualified applicant for a job and they happen to have a disability, that disability would not be something that would be used against that applicant when they are applying for work. Thank you very much.